about it.
We're going to transition now into our main topic of the day. Do you believe in the Negro? And this, for all intents and purposes, this is likely going to be a reoccurring theme series conversation on the Charles Coleman podcast because it's just so layered and complex.
Correct.
The idea of community is, in some respects, overused. And in other respects, it may not be overused, but the concept is something that is undervalued in as much as people talk about it, but they don't really live it.
Right.
From your perspective, from where you sit, right? You are someone who at different points has been about the business of entrepreneurship, economic opportunity in our community, financial literacy, also clearly invested in the development of young people from a self-esteem standpoint around grooming and appearance. So you dabble in a number of different elements of togetherness, right? Like of unity and of galvanizing in that space. What do you see? Because Dr. Claude Anderson, the author of Powernomics and a number of other books, lays out a number of different rules for community, like what it is, what takes a community. And before I, go into all of that, in fact, I'll just encourage anybody who hasn't read it to read it. It's a wonderful book. And he talks a lot about what the rules are to building a community. I want to hear from you. What do you see as, given the different things that you're involved in, what do you see as the most critical elements of community building? And how do we effectively engage those things, or what can we do more to better engage them? Because to me, it's our belief in the Negro, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But I want to hear from you first.
I think building up identity has been on the top of my list. I think kind of the mind. I was raised under the "if you knew better, you'll do better" kind of a mindset growing up. So any information that I've seen or acquired that's helped me in any kind of way, I've never shied away of spreading it and sharing it, hoping that someone else can share the same experience I've had. But I think we have to groom people into their self-identity first, and I think that gives them the motivation to go out here and build a community. Now, once we kind of start, I think then we can define what that should look like, or could look like, or shouldn't look like, but we have to kind of start the engine a little bit.
So that conversation about identity is a tricky one because, we've talked about the idea of there's assumed identity, which is not necessarily authentic. It's just something that you decided to adopt. Then there is embraced identity, which is something that you authentically connect with and identify with and sort of like really accept. This is who I am, and I'm going to stand in this proudly and firmly. And then there's identity that's forced upon you, which we see very much so in terms of Black America, foundational Black America. This is what y'all are. This is what y'all do. This is what y'all are about. Given what we're uniquely positioned, Black Americans, that is, how do you engage that conversation when you're talking about the first thing is identity and understanding who you are and so on and so forth? That's a real challenge because in some ways, if you don't at least identify who the people are who are supposed to convey this, it's not clear in as much as you have the blind leading the blind. Because if that sense of identity, that sense of self, it's not like it just pops up one day and it's just there. It has to come from somewhere. So if you are in a space where none of the people who are around you are aware of it or see it or embrace it, where are you supposed to get that from? Like you and I might have it, right? But then how do you access that, or how do you expect people to access that when everyone around them doesn't have any more of a sense of identity of self than someone, who's younger, who was a child?
I don't know. I really don't know. When you put it that way, it makes it harder to answer. I would like to believe that if there's an appetite for anything, you sort out what you're hungry for, right? So we could be standing in a pizza shop, surrounded by all these different options of pizza. But if I want steak, it doesn't matter that we're in the pizza shop. You get what I'm trying to say?
I get it.
Eventually, once we get out of here, I'm going to go seek a steak.
But if I'm hungry, I'm going to eat.
Well, that's true too. But that's not what we're saying. We're not saying, are we hungry?
I actually was joking, but no, I get it. I think for me, when I talk about the belief in the Negro, community requires a certain degree of boundary. And for us, I see it as, in some ways, physical boundaries. I mean, that's a different conversation in terms of being able to police ourselves. Boundaries take many forms. One example of boundaries, I think, are rules.
Okay.
Right? Like, I think part of, and Dr. Anderson talks about this, one of the tenets of community is you have an agreed set of rules that you decide are going to govern your space, your community. Like, look, we are respecting our elders. We're taking care of our elders. Look, we believe that as a collective, discipline of our young people is everyone's job, right? Like, I mean, just whatever your rules are, right? Like those boundaries. Another tenet of community building clearly is an independently functioning economic system.
Okay.
And for me, that's where the notion of believing in the Negro becomes paramount. Because I feel like anytime I talk about community building and what it looks like, I get so many more people who are telling me why it wouldn't work. Why we would never do that. Oh, they'll never do that. We'll never do that because we can't, so on and so forth. It's met with a bunch of pushback in ways that I just feel like maybe you not with it. You know what I'm saying? Maybe you would not decide to like actively go and seek, I need a black dentist, I need a black banker, I need a black tailor, I need a black butcher. You know what I mean? Maybe you not with that. But part of it, I feel like, is a lack of belief. I'm constantly writing and working on a book. And in my book, I have a chapter called Do You Believe in the Negro? And as part of it, I looked through hip hop because that's a big theme of the book, hip hop, and sort of its impact on my life. And I did some research about the number of lyrics that talk about, from hip hop artists, that talk about having a Jewish lawyer. I can't tell you, like Fab talked about it, Jada talked about it. I got a Jewish lawyer that'll eat the case. Like, for me as a black attorney, I was offended. And I know that a number of other black attorneys were highly offended. Like, literally off the top of my head, I was able to identify, well, off the top of Google's head, I was able to identify 35 different lyrics in contemporary hip hop artists that were sort of like, oh, I have a Jewish lawyer. That is not a belief in the Negro. That is not how you build community. So all the other shit people talking about, oh, well, you know, we got to da-da-da-da-da. When you are putting professional people on a pedestal, like, I got a Jewish account, so he messed with the O's. You know what I'm saying? Like, when you put the people who are essential for providing you foundational services, but don't belong to your community on a pedestal, that message that you send to everybody else is like, yo, these people are not worthy. That is not a belief in the Negro. And it is a serious disruption to community building for me.
Right.
And, you know, we talk about buy black, spend your money black, so on and so forth. But we also don't talk about the fact that, and you can probably speak to this experience more than I can, the idea of, like, number one, everybody wants a discount. They want it for cheaper, right? Like, if buying black should mean, like, building community, believing in the Negro should mean, like, not only am I going to pay you for this, I'm not looking for a hookup, I'm going to pay you what you've asked me for.
Right.
Because I don't go
nowhere
else.
Nowhere.
I don't go to Burberry and be like, yeah, so them loafers, them driving loafers.
That been here 6 months.
They been here, they ain't moved. Let me get them for you said 800? I give you 240.
Word.
We don't do that to anybody else but ourselves.
The audacity. I don't want to bash out people.
It's not bashing out people. It's telling the truth, though.
I think it's a lack of respect. When I see you representing a particular brand, I identify you with the Jukes move. Hey, Charles, you come on now. 500, come on, baby. You know what I'm saying? Immediately. I don't get a backstory of why you chose the $500 price point. None of that. If I see it's you and yours, in my mind, I say you a 240 kind of dude. I'm willing to go up to 220.
Wow. So you think that is a function of programming where we don't necessarily even value ourselves?
Correct.
You don't believe in the Negro.
You do not. And it's a lot harder to try to force that on someone without teaching them how to even identify the Negro and building the respect for the Negro.
So where do you start? I mean, let's no, I get it. What would you say is if you had to, because this is obviously a larger conversation, and we can't be on this podcast all the time. We just ain't got that kind of bread at this network. What would be the one thing that you would want people to think about with community building?
The one thing?
The first thing, anything. Like, you don't have to be the most important thing, but
like I said,
something simple.
Identity. It has to start there. You have to be able to say, hey, I am a Negro and I'm worth the effort that I put out to society.
So here's what I'll do, to end this portion of this conversation and this dialogue. A lot of people might sort of shudder at the use of the word Negro, but when I use it, I'm using it very intentionally because I'm referring to a period in time. Mm-hmm. Negro came as an evolution from post-slavery, post-Reconstruction, but pre-Jim Crow, right? So Negro, and I mean, it was used after used after Jim Crow as well, but like Negro was actually a respectable term because we know the hard ER.
Yeah, it was different.
The hard ER was different. Mm-hmm. And that was used because these Negroes had gotten a little too sedity. These Negroes were going to school. These Negroes were starting businesses. These Negroes were running communities, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why I use the term, do you believe in the Negro? Because I'm referring very poignantly and very directly to a specific period of time where we clearly had demonstrated the potential for self-sustaining communities on our own in such a way that it wasn't even a threat.
Well, when you say on our own, but those, we're talking period piece, right?
Correct.
During that time, that's during segregation.
You're still on our own, though.
Well, is it really?
It ain't. It's not with because the assistance or support of other entities.
Well, I couldn't go nowhere else, so I had to buy black.
Is that a bad thing?
No, it's proven that it hasn't been. But think about society today. You're removing option. It's like, wow.
So you're thinking like it's up, meaning once the option is out there, it's done.
It's done.
You think it's not going back?
We have to, again.
Kurt, you gotta believe in the Negro, baby.
I do believe in the Negro, but the evolved Negro.
What does that look like?
I hope it looks like segregated Negro, to be honest with you, but it will be different. It's a choice now. There's nothing wrong with saying.
You want some Malcolm X shit today.
I'm not, brother. I'm just saying.
I'm not, like, listen, I'm really not mad, and I think that all jokes aside, I think that any person who would not, and because here's the thing, I started the conversation off by identifying the importance of boundaries.
Got you.
Right, like segregation is a hard boundary. It's a really hard boundary, but it's a boundary, right? So anyone who can conceptualize in today's space that there was no value in what community did or how community flourished when we were only left to fend for ourselves amongst ourselves, I would have some serious intellectual qualms with. It doesn't mean that you have to go as far as to say I believe in segregation. I think that for many people is too much of a jump. And I understand why it's too much of a jump. But I also think that, again, there is a need for the notion of boundaries in terms of our culture, in terms of our spaces, because we have been duped into believing that, like, well, if y'all want to be over here, then you got to let us be able to come to the porch, sign out your culture, and bring it back in whatever condition that we want.
Right. Whenever we want.
Whenever we want, right? And that is sort of that's the trick bag in such a way where we feel like, oh, now we have opportunity. So instead of when I get some bread trying to buy my block and keep it from gentrifying, I want to move out. I want to go somewhere else. That's not how you build community. In fact, that's how you disrupt community. That's how you unravel community. So even though the word segregation, of course, because of its historic connotations, carries with it a really, really sordid history of denial, let's maybe transition that word in this conversation to boundaries.
Fair.
Boundaries. Like, we gotta have some. I talk about boundaries all the time. Your non-negotiables. What are your non-negotiables? That's a boundary.
That's a very strong boundary.
It's a strong boundary, right? A community building will not exist if we do not have boundaries, because how else are you going to actually define the community? So for me, I want you to think about, for our listeners who are engaged in this conversation, I want you to think about, do you truly believe in the Negro to the extent that you are willing to support those businesses, even as they may be inconvenient and in the interest of helping to build an independent economic structure? And number two, what are our boundaries as a community? Where do you think our boundaries are? Where do you think they should be? I think that's what listeners from this part of the conversation should take away and think about as we move forward.